Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again to a review that I have been highly anticipating for some time. A review of the novel on Her Majesty's Secret Service. Anticipating for some time because this one has such a good reputation, and honestly, since Goldfinger, I feel like the series, or rather Fleming, has been suffering from a certain kind of fatigue. I mean, when you look at the last few books, it's been a collection of short stories, a film based on a film treatment outline that Fleming was doing with some other guys, and a book that barely featured James Bond at all. So I was looking forward to getting back to something that I enjoyed more along the lines of previous books that I really loved in this series, like Dr. No and Moonraker, From Russia with Love. So with that in mind, let's dive right into talking about On Her Majesty's Secret Service and whether or not I feel that it lives up to its reputation. So, the first few passages of the book take place in something of a non-chronological fashion. The first chapter, the very first chapter, is Bond observing a gorgeous young woman from afar as she steps into the sea with clearly no intention of coming back out again, and Bond saves her, and then we get some details of the events that led these two people to this point. Bond is entangled in Operation Bedlam in the search for Spectre and its leader, Blofeld. The trail has gone somewhat cold, and as such, Bond decides he's going to resign from MI6, which is interesting and very different for the reasons he resigns in the film version, but more on that later. He's currently in France, and that's where he encounters Contessa Teresa de Vicenzo and helps her save face by paying her gambling debts when she recklessly bets in a casino. But not just any casino, no, this is the Casino Royale. I absolutely love this element of the setting, especially after the previous few novels. This feels like something of a return to the roots of the series by going back there, but also Vesper gets a mention, and it turns out that Bond returns to her grave every year to pay some respects. I neglected to mention in my Goldfinger novel review that Vesper received a mention there as well, and you know, after my disappointment of Live and Let Die kind of brushing that whole love story to the side, I love how her memory has crept back into these books, and Bond clearly is still reeling from the loss. By harkening back to Casino Royale, mentioning Vesper and saving Tracy from a suicide, the first few chapters of this book have a wonderfully judged sense of foreboding and futility, I think. I'll say up front, I think this is the most beautifully written of the Fleming books I've read so far, certainly, and these first few chapters are just so captivating, and it is a terrific opening. After paying off Tracy's debts, the pair sleep together, and then after having saved Tracy from suicide, the pair are captured and Bond is taken to the head of the biggest European crime syndicate, who also happens to be Tracy's father. Mark Ange Draco believes that Bond marrying Tracy is the only way to prevent her from trying to commit suicide again, so he offers Bond £1 million in order to do so, and Bond refuses the offer, but says that he's going to date Tracy, and maybe that would help with some of her mental health issues, and besides that, he does seem kind of pretty into her anyway, so he does the gentlemanly thing and refuses the money. There are some really interesting dialogues around this point about money and what it means to Bond, and it turns out that he's not a big fan of the idea of being so wealthy. This was somewhat jarring to me after becoming used to this James Bond preferring a lot of the finer things in life and generally being quite snobby. I guess it just comes down to the fact that he likes quality, and it just so happens that a lot of quality things are expensive, rather than liking expensive things for the sake of them being expensive. He's also a very particular chap as well, obviously liking his cigarettes from a specific maker and so on, but then I guess we have seen him enjoy more simple food, less pretentious food at American diners and the like, so I guess his tastes do change? Anyway, Draco informs Bond of the whereabouts of Blofeld. He's been hiding away in Switzerland and has created a research facility in the Alps at a place called Piz Gloria. Blofeld has applied to be recognised as a count, so Bond poses as Hilary Bray, a reclusive man associated with the College of Arms in London, but so reclusive, he's a guy who's living a wild man existence in the Scottish Highlands, so no one has seen him so recently, so no one will question Bond's cover. Bond visits the College of Arms, and we get a very broadly comedic chapter in which Bond is informed of some of his lineage. Family motto, which of course translates to "the world is not enough." it's interesting to have this information about Bond's heritage, as up until now we haven't really heard much about his past, and I'm not quite sure why Fleming decided to put all this information in just a few passages and kind of dump it all here. All the information just kind of comes to us very thick and fast, but I appreciate it nonetheless. And again, it just kind of feeds into this theme of, like, finality. I don't know, like, obviously I know that there are more Bond books to come after this, but there is just a certain sense of just, I don't know, foreboding futility in this particular book, and I really dig that. So Bond, posing as Bray, needs to go to the Piz Gloria facility, ostensibly, to examine Blofeld's earlobes, as this may or may not constitute evidence enough as to whether or not he is in fact descended from nobility, but of course he's there to do some snooping and see what's going on. I love all the stuff with Bond posing as Bray when he gets to Piz Gloria. I had issues with Bond going undercover in Diamonds Are Forever, in the novel, but here it's perfectly played. Bond meets Blofeld's second-in-command, Irma Bunt, who is in charge of a group of beautiful young women who are there for treatments regarding allergies and irrational fears. I love how Fleming writes Bunt. She's physically repulsive, and she has some very funny lines, and Bond enjoys kind of playing with her. And Bond, of course, quickly meets with Blofeld himself, who isn't really as enigmatically described as he was in Thunderball, and his appearance has been somewhat altered by plastic surgery. Anyway, there's lots of hijinks at the facility, and some really good stuff here. I mean, Bond is nearly found out at one point, and then he actually is found out later on when a fellow agent is captured, and Bond's meeting with Blofeld, and this agent is dragged in by some of Blofeld's men, and in his delirious state, he recognizes Bond, and kind of completely blows his cover by pleading for help, and I just love that chapter so much. Bond is so determined to keep his cover, and doesn't come to the aid of his colleague. Even though he knows that his colleague will probably be tortured and killed, he understands that this cover, this mission, is more important than just this one man, and just hearing his thought process as he makes these decisions is just fantastic. I love these chapters. Bond kind of gets away with it at first, but like later on that night he's like, nah, I know I've been rumbled, the clock's ticking down, I've not got long before they come for me, and so he escapes Piz Gloria, and we have some cool action here as he skis away pursued by Blofeld's men. He then crashes a Christmas Eve party, because it's Christmas Eve, and he's actually getting really desperate here when he bumps into who else but Tracy, who's in the area looking for Bond. She helps him escape, and this is where Bond proposes to her, having really fallen for her in the admittedly very short period of time they've actually spent together. Up until this point, things have been really exciting and engaging, and things moving quite quickly, and then Bond gets back to England, where we have an exceedingly long set of passages of Bond, M, and various government officials deciphering Blofeld's scheme. This is all taking place at M's home, and while there's some funny stuff with him, especially his reaction to the sight of Christmas crackers on his dining table, generally the pace here comes to a screeching halt for me, and things get a little bit dull. But anyway, the men come together and realise that Blofeld's scheme involves brainwashing these women he's treating into carrying biological warfare agents back to the UK as to destroy the country's agricultural economy. So for example, he has one girl there who's there for treatment about chickens, and she comes from a certain area where poultry is a big thing, so he's gonna, destroy all these different aspects of British livestock and vegetation. This kind of bureaucratical talk and such is more realistic, I'm sure, and I get the sense that Fleming really enjoyed the detail he was able to go into in these chapters, but ultimately it would have been more interesting to me had Bond discovered all of this stuff himself while at Piz Gloria, and we weren't, relying on 3, 4, 5 men at a time kind of putting pieces together and making some pretty big leaps of logic to come to the conclusions that they do, but whatever. Bond, of course, wants to take the fight to Piz Gloria immediately, but because it's in Switzerland, there's a lot of official channel diplomacy kind of stuff that takes a long time to figure out and work out, and Bond is like, well, Blofeld's gonna know we're coming, and so he calls on Draco to assault Piz Gloria, and the battle is very exciting, and Bond chases an escaping Blofeld down a bobsled run, and that's all great, but ultimately Blofeld does get away, his plan nonetheless rumbled. So the day is saved, and our hero marries Tracy, and there's some great seeding in this final chapter about as they're getting married, as they're preparing to get married, there are mysterious figures sort of inquiring about the wedding and such, and of course these figures are Blofeld and Bunt, who murder Tracy in a drive-by shooting, and it's really heartbreaking stuff, actually. It's so well described, and the novel ends with Bond cradling his dead wife and informing an inquiring officer on the scene that he and Tracy have all the time in the world. The Bond character is on really exceptional form in this story. I think the balance between the coldness and the more witty sense of humour side of Bond is just perfectly pitched here. I love that we find out so much about his heritage. It's great that we see him finally get a girl to settle down with, even though that dream is incredibly short-lived. I do think that the film vastly improves on how much Bond actually finds out himself about Blofeld's plan, but then in general I think that the films make him a better agent, even though the books might be more realistic and, properly represent how much of a team effort this kind of espionage stuff is. In the supporting cast, Draco is a really great Bond ally in the same vein of Kerim Bey, and the pair's interactions throughout are really great. Really like Draco. Tracy, on the other hand, is a bit of a letdown. I don't think she's all that interesting, and she comes across a bit bland, and I don't know if I entirely buy why Bond would fall for this girl, but then he's fallen for many girls in the past, like Tiffany and Gala, and it just so happens to not work out with those women. I suppose we're to assume that Bond is kind of taken in by her tragic past and backstory, and all that stuff is very interesting and kind of heartbreaking, and don't get me wrong, like, her whole, history is interesting, but I just think her characterization is somewhat lacking in personality, and it's a testament to the film's writers and to Diana Rigg, of course, that the character in the movie is just one of the very best Bond girls in the series, given the material that they had to work with from this novel. Blofeld too is just a little bit of a letdown here. I mean, after his terrific introduction in Thunderball, I was expecting a bit more, and don't get me wrong, I still like him as a villain. It's just that, man, after that introduction in Thunderball, my expectations were so high, and quite possibly unrealistically so. There's an interesting detail to his character, it was in Thunderball as well, and it's here. At Piz Gloria, the bobsled run is used as a method for killing people. Blofeld just, sends them down, and they just, build up speed until they hit the bottom, and if you haven't died of a heart attack or fright before you get there, then, well, sorry. But Bond is woken up in the middle of the night by a scream, and it's someone who has been sent down this bobsled run, one of Blofeld's men, who was kind of, I can't remember if he actually raped one of the girls or if he wanted to rape her, but Blofeld didn't like that, and so he sent the man to his death. And while I'm certainly not an advocate of capital punishment, killing rapists isn't something that's going to make me dislike Blofeld. I don't know, it's a strange bit of morality, and like what we saw in Thunderball. And that's an element that I do not think is in Blofeld in the films. That seems to be something that is purely here, like he's a man of his word, and he doesn't like it when his men, philander away and all that, and I think that's kind of interesting. Bunt is an hilarious henchwoman, and I don't know if I find her terribly threatening, but she's a great presence all the same. I'm very curious to know if she's going to be coming back in the next book, because I know that this is the middle chapter of the Blofeld trilogy, so Blofeld is definitely going to be coming back, but of course in the films, Irma Bunt never returns, and so I'm curious to know if this character will be coming back in some form in the next book. M also has some great moments here, and I love that Bond gets to go to his house and they have Christmas dinner together. It's quite cute, and he's his usual crusty self, which is all good, and the Bond-M interactions continue to be one of my very favourite elements of this series. So when it comes to the film, it's more or less a faithful adaptation of the book, but with some tweaks and changes here and there. There are just some certain events that are, differently ordered, and, the opening, for example, rejigs things. In the book, The chronology is that Bond meets Tracy, pays her debts, sleeps with her, she tries to kill herself, and then is taken to Draco. In the film, Tracy tries to kill herself, then the pair meet, and he pays her debts, then sleeps with her, and then is taken to Draco. And this makes all the difference, because it means she isn't trying to take her own life after meeting Bond. So we get the sense in the film that meeting Bond has perhaps made her not want to kill herself. One of the small but significant character changes is that Bond still composes his resignation letter in the film, but here he's going to resign because he's taken off the Blofeld case, and in the book it's because he doesn't want to be on the Blofeld case, which is a very interesting distinction and a good change, I think. Having him hell-bent on finding Blofeld makes the mission later on all the more exciting and stakesy. In the book, it comes across as a little whiny, like Bond is a quitter, which I guess in the books he kinda is. As I mentioned earlier on, there are just points where Bond is made to be a more active character, which is definitely better for the film version, and the stakes of the Piz Gloria assault are raised further by having Blofeld kidnap Tracy, meaning that Bond and Draco have to rescue her, as well as rumble Blofeld's evil schemes. It's really hard when it comes to saying, like, which experience I enjoyed more, like reading the book or watching the film, because while the film is just one of my favourites in the series, this book is one of my favourites in the series, I don't know, it's kind of a draw. On Her Majesty's Secret Service should be essential reading for all Bond fans. I'd recommend reading the entire series, of course, but if you were only able to read a selection of the very best ones, this would be in that grouping. It's a fantastic thriller. It's so engaging and well written, and I really loved the experience reading this novel, and Fleming is back on the most top of forms here. I'm happy he got whatever he needed to get out of his system with the short stories, the film outline attempt, and The Spy Who Loved Me, because he returned to great formula with this one. Highest of recommends for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So I'm very much on the bandwagon of praise that this particular novel gets. How do you guys out there feel about this particular one? Are there any people who do not feel it lives up to its reputation? Please do let me know, as always, in the comments below, and please feel free to find me on Facebook, Twitter, my Patreon page. All the links are below to those sites. And until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.